What's the value of Lake Erie? Well, it's a major water resource. What's the value of the land around Lake Erie? It's a tremendously fertile agricultural production area.
Typically, when we look at Lake Erie, and particularly from the standpoint of an Ohioan, it's a very large lake. But it's actually the smallest by volume of the Great Lakes and the southernmost of the Great Lakes. Being the southernmost and also the shallowest, if we look at Lake Erie, the maximum depth of Lake Erie is 210 feet. The other lakes are all over 750 feet deep. So those lakes are much larger in volume than Lake Erie is.
I think the public, as on many topics, unless particular citizens are associated through their activities, recreation or their profession or what have you, with Lake Erie, they probably are largely unaware of the threats to Lake Erie and the water quality issues, and may have heard about the big problems, the crises through the news.
The governor of Ohio has declared a state of emergency in and around the city of Toledo. Tests show the area's water is toxic and no one should drink it.
For the second straight day, 400,000 people in and near Toledo, Ohio are being told not to drink the tap water. 3 different labs are testing for toxins.
Lake Erie is unique in that it's been in the news, even in the world news, since at least the late 1960s.
Goes back to the burning of the Cuyahoga River in 1969. Happened in the summer of 1969. That particular incident was covered by Time magazine at a time when this country had severe pollution problems. The very next year, US EPA is formed, NOAA is formed, and we have the first Earth Day. And that's why Lake Erie is often referred to as the poster child for pollution problems in this country.
Other threats to the lake, to a large extent, have been addressed and taken care of, although there's a lot that remains to be done. And I'm referring particularly to toxic contaminants. And those certainly are widespread in the lake sediments as a result of decades of industrial waste that was allowed to go into the lake, basically without any kind of effort to control it for maybe 100 years. But with the advent of the Clean Water Act, those have been by law forced to clean up their act and reduce the concentrations of contaminants.
Lake Erie's health got far better by about the mid-90s, such that it was the epitome of ecosystem restoration. This is what you can do if you really try. You can fix lakes. Since then, we've been seeing some backsliding. We have these big algal blooms. Our dead zones have gotten bigger since about the mid-90s up through today. And of course, that is all been pushed into the media because of the 2014 drinking water shutdown, or the drinking water ban in Toledo. So there are some major concerns in terms of the health of Lake Erie.
I'd say right now the 2 biggest threats to Lake Erie, the first would be excessive nutrient loading, meaning phosphorus and nitrogen too much coming in, and that excessive amount of phosphorus allows blue-green algae, or cyanobacteria is the more accurate name for them. And though that form of algae or cyanobacteria is capable of producing toxins, and those harmful algal blooms and the toxins they produce are what caused us to issue the Do Not Drink order for the city of Toledo in early August 2014. That's the biggest problem facing the lake. When we look at Lake Erie in a cross-section, we typically divide it into 3 lakes. The western basin of Lake Erie, west of Sandusky, Ohio, average depth only 24 feet, so it's very, very shallow. Central basin of Lake Erie is between Sandusky, Ohio and Erie, Pennsylvania. Average depth about 60 feet. The eastern basin of the lake would be east of Erie, Pennsylvania. That's where the deep spot is, or 210 feet, right on just about the border between Ontario and New York.
When we think of the Western Basin, that's really where our harmful algal blooms are. And so in terms of the Western Basin's health, we usually think of it as among the poorest. We move to the Central Basin, we still have issues there. Of course, we don't tend to see blooms forming out there, but the blooms that are in the Western Basin can definitely migrate that way. When we get over to the Eastern Basin, it is so deep over there that it rarely has any of those same types of issues at all. So we would consider the Eastern Basin to be far more healthy than the Central or the Western Basin.
Central basin is where we have the problems with the dead zone, or the cold bottom of the layer. Bottom layer of the lake becomes anoxic or loses all its oxygen.
It's related to the algal blooms, but it's an area of really low oxygen in the bottom waters of the Central Basin. And what that does is it just removes high quality habitat availability to fish. So fish aren't able to use that area in the lake, even though it's typically an area that might actually be really good in terms of food sources, that type of thing.
So this is a chronic problem that has gone on for a long time, largely resulting from excessive algal growth, because the water that has the algal growth in it in the Western Basin does move eastward into the Central Basin, and then those algae die and settle out to the bottom, and they decay, and that's what gives rise to the loss of oxygen.
Over the years, when this happens in lakes, very often it turns out that the problem is caused by excessive nutrients. Things that you would add to your garden to make your garden plants grow. Too many of those same kind of things are getting into Lake Erie and making the algae grow. And too many algae are a problem.
Almost universally, people would say that excessive phosphorus is the largest threat to Lake Erie. And I would go on to say it's the largest threat to most inland lakes and even farm ponds for that matter, because phosphorus is the nutrient that's in shortest supply relative to the needs of plants for their growth in the aquatic situations. And so therefore, if you add more phosphorus because it's limiting, then you're going to get more growth, not only of aquatic plants such as submerged vegetation and cattails and so on, but you will also get more algal growth. And it's that increased algal growth that creates so many problems secondarily because of the algal growth that makes it such a major threat. Phosphorus is one of the elements, and it occurs in a number of forms. It occurs naturally in minerals. So phosphorus is not a bad thing. All plants need phosphorus. All animals need phosphorus. We have phosphorus in us, and it's part of our DNA and other molecules in our bodies. The problem is when it's in excess.
There is a problem with too many nutrients going into Lake Erie. Now, if you're going to solve that problem, you need to know where the nutrients are coming from. One of the ways we have been involved in trying to answer this question is to measure the total amount of phosphorus that is coming down various rivers, like the Maumee River, like the Cuyahoga River, like the Sandusky, like the Grand, like the Vermilion. We discovered that when you're trying to measure how much material is going down a river, you have to study it during storm runoff events or rainstorms or floods, because when it comes to runoff from the landscape, whether it's parking lots or cropland or forests, whatever, most of that runoff occurs during storm events.
Agricultural runoff is entirely dependent upon the amount of agriculture and how much rain you get. You have a drought year like 2012, you don't get very much because you only have runoff off of an agriculture field when it rains. You have an incredibly wet year like 2011, and you get a huge amount.
Well, we were designated in 1980, so we've been an active reserve for 35 years. There are 2 in the Great Lakes of the National Estuarine Research Reserves, one in Lake Superior, which is considered to represent the upper Great Lakes, and then us in Lake Erie, which we are representing the lower Great Lakes.
We all monitor water quality at 4 different spots in our estuaries, looking at basic information like pH, oxygen content, how clear the water is or cloudy the water is, and then also nutrient content. So nitrogen, phosphorus, kind of the important nutrients that can turn into pollutants when they occur in too high of concentrations. Some of those parameters we are monitoring every 15 minutes. We have equipment out in the estuary that automatically senses those data and records them, and then we also collect water samples about every 2 to 3 weeks.
There are various approaches to farming that can have a big impact on the movement of nutrients off the landscape. So these different kinds of practices that people can do are called best management practices. And we refer to them as BMPs. And so there are a lot of agricultural BMPs that will have an impact on reducing the amount of erosion on the landscape, such as if you have ground cover year-round on the field, that'll reduce the impact of the rainfall and reduce erosion, and therefore also reduce the amount of sediment getting into streams. And because a lot of the phosphorus, in fact most of it, is attached to the sediment particles, then it also reduces the amount of phosphorus going down the stream.
There's been a lot of work looking at what's going on in the watershed with agriculture and how those impacts can be reduced. And we do a lot of work here. Our research and stewardship and outreach and education programs are all fairly well integrated. So we have someone that works really closely with farmers in our watershed to try to get them to implement best management practices to have a reduced impact on the watershed and on water quality. And then we can actually monitor that through our research program. So we're really ramping up to try to do some larger scale programs in the watershed to get the farmers to hopefully adopt these better practices, and then we can see a result in our water chemistry data.
There are still farmers out there who don't know this, who they're relatively far from the watershed, and they have listened to people over the years tell them that it's lawn fertilizer or it's sewage on the Great Lakes. Those things contribute, simply not as much as agriculture. By the same token, this is important. To solve it, we all need to take action. When I say that agriculture is the largest source, 100% true, but they're not the only source. And so we need to have the sewage treatment plants do a better job, and each of us as individuals needs to do a better job. So nobody can sit back and say, that's an agricultural problem. We can't solve it without ag taking action, but we can't solve it if only ag takes action.
This is a 70-foot long research vessel. It's an aluminum research vessel, and it's multi-purpose. We can stay out for a week or two at a time with a full complement of scientists and technicians and vessel crew, We travel across the lake and stay at a number of different ports and for lots of different purposes.
Lake Erie is interesting and it's got a strong nutrient gradient as you go from west to east. And along with that, you kind of have different temperature regimes. So just that diversity of habitats across the lake kind of creates an interesting place to do fish work.
Second biggest problem facing the lake would be invasive species.
Invasive species is a non-native species whose presence threatens native species. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of 185 invasive species in Lake Erie. There are invasive fish, invasive plants, invasive snails, invasive zooplankton, and invasive algae. So it spans the entire range of life.
When we think about the Great Lakes, they are constantly changing in terms of the organisms that live there due to the introduction of species either accidentally or on purpose. Invasive species are always a concern, particularly any that are going to impact our fish health and the different fish communities that we have here that are economically or culturally important.
Many times, as is true of most invasive species that are very successful, they don't have natural controls on them to prevent them from becoming very abundant, and so they really become overabundant. And we saw that with the zebra mussel in Lake Erie, which just, when it first came in the late 1980s, was just totally covering various objects in the lake. They can actually attach, unlike our native clams, which can't attach to objects. Ever since, the Great Lakes ecosystem, particularly the Lake Erie ecosystem, has been different. The food web has been modified. The energy flow through that system is different than it used to be.
One of the top threats right now among the fish species in Lake Erie is the grass carp. It was discovered for the first time in Lake Erie in 1983, I believe. There were sporadic reports up until about 3 or 4 years ago, and we started hearing about more and more fish being captured in Canadian waters, in Michigan waters, in Ohio waters, and most recently in the Sandusky River.
They are not a fish that you can catch hook and line. They're a plankton eater, so they're going to eat the algae and the small microscopic bugs that eat the algae. They need large rivers to spawn. They need warm water. Lake Erie is the warmest. So we have all the right conditions, and we have the most plankton, most algae, far more than any of the other lakes.
Once they're in the lake, it's very difficult to eliminate them or control them. Some species get into the lake and never establish. Others get into the lake and become very problematic. Well, I can give an example of one of the primary things that's been done to try to restrict the introduction of new species, and that is controlling ballast water that is released into the lakes from oceanic vessels. Anytime a vessel comes from another location into the Great Lakes, it potentially brings with it the species that were wherever it was previously. So that was one of the big efforts that began many years ago and continues today to control where ballast water is taken in and released. Furthermore, there are also vessels that are strictly in the Great Lakes. They do not leave the Great Lakes. They're called lakers. And the use of those lakers is one of the things that's being done to try to minimize the spread of invasive species.
It's helpful for the public to understand the basic nature of the problems and to recognize that it is going to take time to deal with these problems. They need to also keep the pressure on that we do get on with addressing the problems. It's important too that they not urge people to act so fast that we go off in all directions and waste a lot of money. That is, we still need to have targeted, effective, efficient environmental control programs. And the public should demand that, but they need to also recognize that that takes investment in science, it takes time.
There are a lot of ways that people can help take care of the lake. They can start with their own yards, so people can install rain barrels, they can build rain gardens, and that can all help keep the rain in their yards as opposed to letting it just run off into the waterways.
So let's say that I put in low-flow toilets and low-flow shower heads, and I reduce my water consumption by 50%. That's what I did at my home. That's the same thing that we have done at Stone Laboratory. Replace all of our toilets and shower heads with low-flow units. Reduce the amount of water that you send to the sewage treatment plant. So each of us, simply by reducing our water consumption, can actually reduce the amount of phosphorus that we send to the lake by the amount of the reduction.
One actually more emerging threat, I guess, would be recognition that there are a lot of plastics in our water. We're just really kind of keeping plastic bags, all sorts of plastics, where it belongs instead of on the land is really important. So some of it's just kind of basic being a good citizen.
I always tell people to find something they're interested in, because if you're interested in it, you'll be more inclined to do it on your own or stick with it. Anything you can do to kind of minimize your carbon footprint will actually help the lake and Ohio's system in general.
A good environment, a good ecosystem at Lake Erie is critically important. Often I'll hear people say, we can't do this cleanup effort. What do you want, a good economy or a good environment? And I tell them I want both.
It's the one thing I can emphasize to anybody who wants to go visit Lake Erie. There are some amazing beaches, there's some really great islands, and then there's a lot of fun things to do. And just because Western Basin has an issue doesn't mean the whole lake has an issue, and it's definitely worth going to see.
Though Lake Erie has its problems, it is still such a valuable resource. We need to take care of it, and we need to have some ownership over it. This is our backyard. The more that we can help it, the better we'll all be, and the more of kind of a jewel we'll be in the Great Lakes system.